Welcome to ILTV's Israel Daily. I'm Lauren Izo. And coming up in this edition, Israel says an investigation into war crimes by the ICC is anti-Semitic, but it could take years until someone is charged. Could Iran be responsible for ecological terrorism? One Israeli minister says the Islamic Republic poisoned Israel's shores. And bionic electronics could be coming. Israeli scientists want to use animal parts and microphones and cameras.
We firmly oppose and are disappointed by the ICC prosecutor's announcement of an investigation into the Palestinian situation. We will continue to uphold our strong commitment to Israel and its security, including by opposing actions that seek to target Israel unfairly.
That was U.S. State Department spokesman Ned Price reinforcing the U.S. position on the recent launch of an investigation into alleged war crimes by Israelis and Palestinians. The International Criminal Court announcing on Wednesday that their formal probe would soon launch, drawing criticism from Jerusalem as well.
The decision of the International Court to open an investigation against Israel today for war crimes is absurd. It's undiluted anti-Semitism and the height of hypocrisy. Without any jurisdiction, it decided that our brave soldiers, who take every precaution to avoid civilian casualties against the worst terrorist in the world, who deliberately target civilians, it's our soldiers who are war criminals.
Meanwhile, Palestinians welcoming the opening of the investigation.
أعتقد هذا القرار مهم جدا في سياق أن هناك فعلا عدالة ستفرض على من يقوم بالجرائم ضد الشعب الفلسطيني أو أي جرائم في العالم، وبالتالي ما قام به الاحتلال من جرائم متواصلة كان يعتقد أنه معفي من غبة مساءلته أمام هذه الجرائم.
Let's speak with Professor of International Law from Hebrew University, Robbie Sable. Thank you so much for joining me today, sir.
Thank you for inviting me.
Jerusalem and Washington seem to have brushed this probe off as something offensive and meaningless, but now Israel is moving to protect officials from it. How afraid should Israel be of this investigation?
In the short term, not. In the long term, it is worrying. It's a political move. It's strange that the International Criminal Court can't touch anybody in Syria or Iran, but they've picked on the only democratic state in the area, Israel. And I think on this issue, we have the United States with us. The United States in the past has taken firm efforts to make sure that no US official or soldier will be brought before the court. And I think it's fair to assume that they'll help Israel on this issue as well.
Speaking of the U.S., Ned Price also said that the Palestinians do not qualify as a sovereign state and therefore are not qualified to obtain membership as a state or to participate as a state or to delegate jurisdiction to the ICC. Do you think that this is going to affect Biden's hope to reconnect with the Palestinians in the future?
I don't think so. In other words, Biden's position is that in the future, there should be a Palestinian state, and Israel is willing to negotiate that issue. The question is whether at the moment there is a real Palestinian state, and Israel's position is that it doesn't exist at the moment, and this is the US position as well.
So while the probe is launching now, it could be months or even years until any kind of charge or warrant is produced. What is involved in this process?
The first stage is they'll have to ask Israel whether we want to investigate the crimes, the purported crimes ourselves. And Israel has said already that whenever there's a suspicion that a soldier has committed a crime, it is investigated by Israel. So we'll have to answer that. Then the next stage is they'll do their own investigation. Normally they interrogate the victims first, and only then will they ask for the Israel to cooperate. Israel's policy is we provided information. We will not, however, allow the court to investigate individual Israeli soldiers or officials, or I assume will be allow them to come to Israel to do that.
So I'm curious, what do you predict? Will anyone be prosecuted as a result of this investigation?
We have they shouldn't be. Under any normal court system, they wouldn't be. However, we are worried that this is a political institution and political step by the Palestinians. It's not a question of real law. It's a question of trying to smear Israel with crimes. And we are worried that the court up to now has only dealt with African, and they may want to find a Western, what they call a Western state, to try and charge. They tried with the United States and with the United Kingdom and reached a conclusion they couldn't do it. There may be elements in the court who would like to try and have an Israeli accused in order to prove to the world that the court is charging Western states as well. And this, frankly, is our worry.
Interesting. Well, we'll have to wait and see how this develops. Professor, thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
An Israeli minister is claiming that Iran is the culprit, responsible for a devastating oil spill, the worst disaster in the history of Israel's coastlines. The contamination killed wildlife, led Israel to shut beaches, and banned eating fish from the sea. Here's what Israel's Minister of Environmental Protection had to say.
We have located the crude oil tanker which has polluted the Israeli shoreline. It is owned by a Libyan company and was carrying a cargo from Iran to Syria. This is environmental terror. We have succeeded in identifying these who polluted our country's shores and will bring them to justice. We will sue for compensation in the name of all the citizens of Israel for the damage to the health, the nature, and the flora and the fauna. Now we are finding out that Iran is operating terrorism, not just by using nuclear weapons or by trying to establish itself around our borders. Iran is operating terrorism by damaging the environment. And when Iran is damaging the environment, it isn't just hurting the state of Israel.
The problem here is that she seems to be standing alone. Officials are claiming her announcement was not approved and may not even be true. But if true, this could escalate tensions between Jerusalem and Tehran on a different level than ever before. Let's clear up the confusion with Professor Nir Bohms, a Dayan Center Research Fellow from Tel Aviv University. Thank you for joining us today.
Good to be here.
So after listening to Gila Gamliel, how likely is it that this ecological disaster was intentionally caused by Iran? Can that be proved?
Well, Gila Gamliel said what she said based on an investigation, and she seems to have some evidence, although it also seems that the IDF, the security agencies in Israel did not yet confirm this, and therefore I will take a bit of a cautionary note to say that this is still yet need to be substantiated. What seems to be the case is that, of course, there was a spill. There is probably probability that this particular ship was involved in it. Whether it was deliberate or not, that's a separate question. Whether Iran is connected to it, seems to be more clear. If the ship sails in Iran, it seems that it carried oil that came from Iran going to Syria. It also seems that this is another, it's not the only one, an old ship that sailed without instruments in order for it not to be tracked. And they did not be tracked, not just because they might have seek to create an ecological disaster in Israel and in Lebanon, by the way. They wanted not to be tracked because they smuggled oil illegally to Syria.
Okay, yeah, speaking of that illegal oil smuggling, you mentioned when we spoke before that that is another issue that this story is highlighting.
Iran is under a sanctions regime. It cannot export oil. Its economy is depleted, and it needs to do anything it can in order to export some of its oil it is able to produce. The way this is done is illegally with ships, sometimes a ship like an Emerald, which is a very old ship that is not going to be even allowed to properly dock at the European port because of the regulations, the environmental and safety regulations. So they would take ships like that, put it on another country's flag, sometimes change the flag. It seems that two other countries were involved in this, and then they would go sail without the AIS system, the automatic positioning system, and they would go to their destination, usually another country like Syria that's not supposed to get it. That has been the case for a number of years. Ships like that continue to sail across the seas. Iran is able to export oil in this way, again, illegally, black market, literally, after the disaster here, very much black.
So say it is possible that the attack was intentional. You know, first we had the Israeli cargo ship attacked in the Persian Gulf, and now this. If it is plausible and true, could this be a new sort of proxy war between Israel and Iran?
Look, for what I've heard, even in the last few days, is that the security agencies here do say that they have dealt with a number of attempts, terrorism-related attempts that Iran was responsible for. We've seen some cyber attempts. We've seen, of course, in the last few years, literal terrorist attacks outside of Israel. We've seen a number of threats. If this will join the list, then I would say it's a relatively simple, low-tech attempt to create, sabotage in the water systems. Of course, the side of the ecological disaster. Part of the issue here is whether there's going to be a pollution of the desalinated water, which Israel relies on, and that could be a target. Iran tried to sabotage water systems before using cyber attacks. So it's not implausible, but that does not mean that this particular case is substantiated. And Iran and Israel are at war. We are fighting in Syria. We are fighting proxy wars in other places. There are attacks that happened in Iran, different nuclear scientists that find themselves in bizarre circumstances ending their lives. And some, according to foreign sources, it also seems to attribute some of that to Israel. We are at war.
All right, Professor, thank you so much for your insights today.
You're welcome.
Moving on now, the floodgates will open on March 7th when Israel once again opens its international airport after it was essentially shut for more than a month to citizens without special permission and all foreigners. Now subject to approval of the full cabinet, the airport will reopen next week, just in time to bring Israelis home to vote in the March 23rd election. From Sunday onwards, Israel will likely allow 1,000 Israelis per day to return, rising to 3,000 a day from Sunday, March 14th. The Exemptions Committee will also be dissolved. Those flying to Israel will be required to undertake one COVID test before boarding the flight and a second test before entering Israel. They will be allowed to isolate at home rather than in a hotel, but may be asked to wear an electric bracelet. Only Israelis who have been vaccinated and hold a green passport will be allowed to fly abroad, and they will be exempt from isolation when returning home. Perhaps Israel is acting too fast. That's the case if you ask the head of the country's COVID-19 task force, Nachman Ash. Following the announcement of the airport opening next week, Ash calling it far from the ideal, saying it could set the country back. Chana Rifkin reports on the tricky balance between vaccines and coming out of lockdown.
Israel's coronavirus chief says he would not rule out another lockdown, especially as the country plans to reopen its airport, saying the decision could bring new COVID strains into the country. He said, "We have a few critical weeks ahead. We will have to see if there is an increase in morbidity. It's absolutely possible that we will see more seriously ill people. We may have to impose further restrictions, and we may even have to impose another lockdown." Meanwhile, on Wednesday, the health ministry recorded 4,143 new cases, with a positive infection rate of 5.2%. There are 699 patients in serious condition, with 224 on ventilators. 5,815 Israelis have died from the virus. As of Wednesday, nearly 5 million Israelis received the first dose of the vaccine, and approximately 3.5 million received both doses. Officials say the vast majority of COVID-19 deaths in February were recorded among people who haven't been vaccinated. Last month, 78% of the 935 coronavirus patients who died were not vaccinated at all or received just one vaccine dose. Today, Israel will begin its campaign to vaccinate some 120,000 Palestinians who are legally employed in Israel and West Bank settlements, using Moderna vaccination stock. Israel's military liaison to the Palestinians said it will roll out the immunization campaign at checkpoints and industrial zones across the West Bank. Also, cultural institutions are opening next week for holders of green passports, including theaters, restaurants and cafes, hotels, and more. There's even a series of stadium concerts planned for Tel Aviv, a first in more than a year. Chana Rifkin, ILTV.
So as the country gets ready to open up cultural institutions, some smaller businesses who are now permitted to open up say the damage done by the pandemic means it will be a while until they will be able to open up just like everyone else. Unlike the big hotel chains and concert stadiums, smaller companies are finding themselves in debt and unable to bounce back at the drop of a hat. Let's speak to Daniela Crankshaw, the co-founder and executive artistic director at Center Stage Israel, the country's first professional English language theater. Daniela, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me, Lauren.
So Daniela, it must have been quite exciting for you to hear that you could finally open up after a year of closing your doors to audiences. What did you think when you first heard the news?
It was definitely exciting, and I was thrilled, but at the same time, I think I had mixed feelings, because I know that as much as this year has been devastating for theatre and a lot of people, I think that the next year is going to be just as hard in a different way. And I think for theatre as a live art form, it's been harder than most, because we haven't been open during the year. We can't offer off-the-shelf products or go online like other companies have. We have gone online in various ways, but it's not the same as being open and having that live theatre experience. So excitement, definitely, but also trepidation and concern about reopening.
So are you able to open up right now? Will you be opening up alongside all the other bigger cultural institutions? And if not, what is making it difficult for you?
Well, I think there's a difference between, smaller theatres than these big institutional theatres. We are a private company. We built this theatre on our own. We opened 3 months before COVID struck. And then for a year, we've been out of business. So literally any business that is not bringing any revenue for a month or two can't survive. Imagine a year of not having that. But I think the bigger theaters have an advantage, because they have shows maybe waiting in the wings. They have a huge marketing machine. They have a large following, subscribers. We have the challenge of being smaller subscribers. We have to start pre-production, we have to audition, we have to go into rehearsals. So we're not going to see ourselves really opening with productions for quite a while. What we can do in the meantime is potentially open with smaller events for our community. Luckily, we have a theatre and a bar lounge, so we can use the bar lounge for stand-up comedy or live music events and things like that. But in terms of theatre proper, I think that's going to take a while. And, getting the audience back in is also going to be a challenge. There's a lot of fear out there. There's a lot of concern. And we have to make sure that we stand by the regulations, that we do everything we can do to make the audience feel safe enough to come back to our theatre.
Well, speaking about, what we can do in the meantime, how do you recommend people still keep art a part of their lives, during this time that they can't necessarily go to all the places that they thought they would be? And how can they support smaller businesses like Center Stage?
I think what's important is to understand that recovery cannot happen without culture. We need culture. It's part of our lifeblood. It's what keeps us going. But I think that we have to start a hybrid situation. I think we're going to have live theatre together with the option of Zoom. So while people who cannot come, who have potentially immune issues or cannot be vaccinated, can still enjoy the theatre with a semblance of a feeling of being in live theatre, because there will be a live audience to a degree. But people need to support us. We're part of the lifeblood of the community, and we intend to be there for a long, long time.
It's all about adaptation. What can I say? Daniela Crankshaw, thank you so much for being with us, and good luck.
Thank you so much, Lara.
Well, Israeli scientists have successfully wired a locust ear into a robot. and say the breakthrough could pave the way for animal parts to become microphones and cameras of the future. The robot at Tel Aviv University listens to sounds around it using the ear of a dead locust. Researchers behind the breakthrough say it is the first time a sense organ has been integrated into electronics. Let's speak with Dr. Ben Maoz from the Department of Biomedical Engineering at Tel Aviv University. Thank you for joining us today, sir.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So how does this technology actually work?
So actually the idea is that currently the human being is trying to develop sensors that nature was able to develop through millions of years of evolution. So the insect world actually has amazing sensors that we are not even able to be close to them with the current technology. And what we were trying to do, we were trying to actually take such sensors from the insect kingdom and to integrate them with the actual robot. So actually what we did was take the hearing system of a locust and to use it as a sensor for a real robot. So imagine that you have your home Roomba that actually it can move by listening to a real sound with a real biological ear. So this is the main concept.
So you've successfully experimented with locusts, but what are the ultimate possibilities here?
So definitely, most people will ask, well, why do we need to use actually the ear system if we have such good microphones and speakers? So since this project was so ambitious, we started with something that is relatively easy or easier by actually being able to compare the ear from the locust to a microphone. But you have other sensors such as the nose that we're not even close with today's technology to mimic the sensing capabilities of a nose. Insects are able to separate between millions of chemicals, different odors, and they are very, very sensitive with this specific example. And we're not even able to mimic such sensors with today's technology.
And I have to ask, has there been any pushback from animal activists over this technology, this research?
So first of all, we'll start by saying that obviously we are doing everything with all the authorizations and all the things according to the guidelines of Israel and the world. And also what we're doing, we're using insects that with all this issue are different than using obviously dogs or cats or things like this. Actually, locust is actually a problem in the world that people are trying to migrate. And I can give you another example that, for example, using the sense of a mosquito can sense really tiny differences in the CO2, right? They know immediately how to identify us and to suck our blood because they are really sensitive with identifying really small changes with CO2 in the air. So this is another example of an insect that people will rather see that will disappear in that sense and not. And yes, regarding this question.
It's really amazing the way nature can inspire us. Thank you so much for being with us today. We really appreciate it and best of luck.
Thank you very much for inviting us.
All right, let's take a look at the weather forecast with Chana Rifkin.
Hey Lauren, lows tonight expecting a drop to about 49 degrees Fahrenheit or 9 degrees Celsius. Moving into the weekend now, clear sunny skies over the next couple of days with Friday calling for highs of around 70 degrees Fahrenheit or 21 degrees Celsius. Then Saturday expecting a range of 49 to a high of 74 degrees Fahrenheit or about 10 to 24 degrees Celsius.
Thanks, Chana. And now before we go, let's take a look at what's going viral in Israel. Oh, he's getting down on one knee. His friends are going wild. I think he's asking her to marry him. It looks like an IDF soldier proposing to his girlfriend in front of all of their friends. How sweet. I hope they can have their wedding after the pandemic is over. All right, that's it for today's news. Today's exchange rate is 3.32 shekels to the American dollar and 2.62 shekels to the Canadian dollar. For more news from ILTV, please like ILTV on Facebook, follow us on Instagram, and subscribe to our YouTube channel. Don't forget to visit the all-new and improved ILTV website at iltv.tv and subscribe to our newsletter for the latest updates while you're there. I'm Lauren Izzo. Thank you for watching.